In a quiet corner of a very old university, there was a room that didn't look like the others. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something that felt like history. Most students walked past it without glancing inside, but the musicians knew what was kept there. It wasn't a secret treasure or a pile of gold. It was something much more frustrating. It was a single stack of paper sitting on a music stand in the center of the room. This was no ordinary sheet music. It was known simply as the impossible piece. The story of this music started many years ago, written by a man who was considered a genius by some and a madman by others. He had spent his life trying to push the boundaries of what human hands could do. He didn't care if people liked his music. He only cared if it was possible to play. When he finished this specific composition, he didn't celebrate. He just smiled and put it away, knowing he had created something the world wasn't ready for. The paper was filled with notes, so many notes that they looked like a swarm of black ants crawling over the page. To a normal person, it just looked like messy ink. But to a pianist, it looked like a nightmare. The problem wasn't just that the music was fast. The problem was the way the notes were arranged. The composer had written chords that required a person to stretch their fingers farther than any human hand naturally could. He had placed notes for the left hand and the right hand in places that forced them to crash into each other. It was as if he had asked a runner to sprint a mile in 3 seconds or asked a bird to fly without moving its wings. It was a physical puzzle that seemed to have no solution. Over the years, this piece of music became a legend in the classical world. It was a test that only the bravest or most arrogant musicians would dare to attempt. Big names in the industry, famous concert pianists who played in grand halls filled with thousands of people, had come to this room to try their luck. They would walk in with their heads held high, confident that their years of training and their perfect technique would conquer the score. One famous musician, a man known for his lightning-fast fingers, sat at the piano for 5 hours. He rubbed his hands together, cracked his knuckles, and stared at the pages until his eyes burned. When he finally started to play, the sound was jagged and uneven. He struggled to hit the right keys, his hands twisting into strange shapes that looked painful. Halfway through the first page, he stopped. He slammed the lid of the piano shut, stood up, and walked out without saying a word. He looked angry, but also a little bit defeated. For someone who had mastered every other piece of music in existence, this was a hard blow. Another pianist, a woman who taught at the most prestigious music school in the country, tried a different approach. She decided to use science. She measured the distance between the keys, calculated the speed of her reflexes, and tried to rearrange her seating position to give herself more leverage. She thought that if she was smart enough, she could outsmart the composer. But the music didn't care about her calculations. It demanded a fluidity that numbers couldn't provide. After 2 days of trying, she packed up her bag and admitted defeat. She told the others that the music wasn't written for humans. She said it was written for a machine, or perhaps for a ghost with 6 fingers on each hand. Slowly, the excitement turned into resignation. The music was locked away in a glass case, more of a museum exhibit now than a song. Professors used it as a warning to their students. They would say, "Don't get too cocky. No matter how good you are, there are things you cannot do." The piece became a symbol of limitation. It reminded everyone that even with all our practice and dedication, we all have a wall we will eventually hit. The general consensus was that the manuscript contained a mistake. People started saying the composer had made a typo, or that he was cruel for writing something that couldn't be played. The room grew quiet again. The dust began to settle on the piano keys. The impossible piece sat silently in its case, waiting for a day that most people believed would never come. The world of classical music moved on. They played Mozart, they played Beethoven, and they played Chopin. They played music that was beautiful and structured and made sense. They forgot about the strange, chaotic notes that had gathered dust in the old university room. Everyone agreed that some secrets were meant to stay buried. They were convinced that no one, not now and not ever, would be able to make those black dots on the paper sing. They were wrong, of course. They just didn't know it yet. The solution wasn't going to come from a master with years of experience. It was going to come from someone who didn't even know the meaning of the word impossible. The summer heat was intense, but inside the grand rehearsal hall of the music festival, the air was cool and crisp. Yet, despite the air conditioning, there was a different kind of heat filling the room. It was the heat of competition, skepticism, and a heavy dose of pride. This year, the festival directors had decided to do something different. They had pulled that dusty, forgotten manuscript out of the archives. They called it a challenge. They wanted to see if the modern masters could finally solve the puzzle that had baffled musicians for decades. The room was filled with people who were considered the best of the best. There were professors from the most expensive music academies in the world, wearing their formal suits and looking very serious. There were young winners of international competitions, known for their speed and precision. They all carried themselves with a certain air, a quiet confidence that said, "I can play anything. Give me the notes and I will make music." When the thick binder containing the sheet music was placed on the grand piano in the center of the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. The piano itself was a beautiful, shiny black beast, polished to perfection. It waited like a patient animal. The first musician to approach was a man famous for his technical ability. He had hands that were large and strong, perfect for reaching wide distances. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and cracked his knuckles. The audience leaned forward. This was it. They were about to see history being made. He started to play. At first, the sound was powerful and loud. He attacked the keys with the confidence of a conqueror. But within 30 seconds, the music began to fight back. The complex rhythm, which was supposed to flow like water, started to sound jagged and broken. The musician's face, which had started out calm, began to twitch with effort. He was trying to force his hands to do things they simply didn't want to do. He hit a wrong note, then another. He stopped, took a deep breath, and tried again. But it was no use. The music was falling apart in his hands. Eventually, he slammed his hands on the keys in frustration and stood up, shaking his head. "It's a joke," he muttered as he walked off the stage. "It's not music. It's a trap." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The confidence began to drain away. The next person to try was a woman known for her delicate touch and her deep understanding of music theory. She didn't try to force the notes like the first man. Instead, she tried to outsmart the composer. She spent a long time just looking at the pages, analyzing the patterns, humming to herself. She thought that if she could just find the logic behind the madness, she could make it work. She sat down and began to play very slowly. She was playing the notes correctly, or at least she was trying to. But by slowing it down, the song lost its magic. It sounded like a clock ticking erratically. It had no soul, no emotion. It sounded like a math problem being read out loud. She tried to speed up, but the moment she did, her fingers got tangled. It was like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach while riding a bicycle. Her brain couldn't send the signals fast enough to her hands. She played through the first page, sweating and tense, but when she reached the end, there was no applause. There was just silence. She looked up at the crowd, her eyes tired, and shrugged her shoulders. "It is physically impossible," she said softly. "No human being has the coordination for this." For the next 3 days, this pattern repeated itself. One by one, the masters took their turn at the piano. One pianist, known for his lightning speed, tried to rush through the difficult parts, hoping that if he played fast enough, no one would notice the mistakes. It sounded like a blur of noise, a messy thunderstorm of banging keys. It wasn't pleasant to listen to. Another musician tried to rearrange the notes, changing the music to fit his hands, but then it wasn't the song anymore. It was just a random collection of sounds. The mood in the hall grew heavy. The initial excitement turned into frustration and then into a kind of grim acceptance. The musicians started gathering in small groups during the breaks, arguing in hushed whispers. They were defensive. No one likes to admit defeat, especially not people who have spent their entire lives being told they are geniuses. "It's not us," one professor argued, gesturing wildly with a coffee cup. It's the writing. The composer made a mistake. He wrote something that looks good on paper but doesn't work in real life. It's a waste of time, another agreed, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. We are the best players in the world. If we can't play it, nobody can? It's just a theoretical exercise. It was never meant to be heard. By the end of the third day, the beautiful grand piano looked lonely. The stack of paper sat there, mocking them. The experts had tried every technique they knew. They used their strength, their speed, their intellect, and their years of experience. They had stretched their fingers until they hurt and memorized patterns that made their heads spin. But the result was always the same. The music refused to come to life. It remained a stubborn, silent collection of ink dots. The festival organizers held a final meeting. They looked at the exhausted musicians who were packing up their bags and looking defeated. They realized that the challenge had failed. There would be no grand performance. There would be no headline declaring the piece finally solved. The consensus was final. The piece was unplayable. It was a dead end, a musical myth that was better left alone. They decided to lock the manuscript away again. The next morning, a technician was called to the hall to pack up the music and turn off the lights on the stage. The experts were gone, leaving behind their ego and their frustration. They walked away with their heads held high, convincing themselves that the failure wasn't theirs, but that the music was simply flawed. They believed that they had done all that could be done. They were certain that no human hands could ever tame those wild, chaotic notes. They thought the story was over. They were ready to go back to playing the safe, familiar songs that they knew they could master, but in their haste to leave, and their arrogance to believe they were the ultimate judges of music, they had left the door to the rehearsal hall slightly ajar, and they had forgotten one very important thing about the world of music. Sometimes the hardest problems aren't solved by the people who know the most. Sometimes they are solved by the people who don't know enough to be afraid. As the technicians began to move around the stage, a small shadow appeared in the doorway. It was someone who hadn't heard the experts' debates. Someone who didn't know that the task was impossible. The real story was just about to begin. While the great minds of the music world were busy rubbing their sore hands and arguing about the physics of sound, there was someone else in the room who had gone completely unnoticed. In the very back row, sitting on a folding chair that was much too big for her, was a little girl. She was only 8 years old, with scuffed shoes and a ribbon that was slowly coming loose from her hair. She was the daughter of the stage technician, a quiet man who was currently busy adjusting the spotlights near the ceiling. She had tagged along with her father that morning because it was the school holidays, and there was no one else to watch her for most of the day. The girl had sat perfectly still, clutching a small, half-eaten sandwich in one hand and watching the spectacle unfold with wide eyes. To her, the scene on stage was baffling. She watched these adults-people who wore expensive suits and had very serious faces sit down at the beautiful grand piano and make terrible noises. She saw them frown, she saw them sweat, and she saw them storm off in anger. She couldn't understand why they were so upset. To her ears, the piano was the most wonderful toy in the world. It made noise when you touched it, and if you touched it the right way, it could sing, but these grown-ups weren't singing. They were fighting the instrument. It looked like they were trying to wrestle a bear. The little girl didn't know anything about music theory. She couldn't read the complex black dots that covered the pages of the manuscript. She didn't know what a crescendo was, and she had never heard of a polyrhythm. She only knew what she liked. And what she liked was when the notes sounded like rain falling on a roof, or like birds talking to each other. As the hours passed, the girl became more and more curious. The experts in the room were using big words to explain why they couldn't play the music. They talked about impossible intervals and structural limitations. They sounded very smart, but the girl didn't believe them. She watched one pianist try to stretch his hand across the keys to reach a chord that was too wide. He failed, gritting his teeth in pain. The girl tilted her head to the side. She thought to herself, *, if it hurts, why don't you just use your other hand to help? Asterisk to her, the solution was simple. If you can't reach something, you move closer. If you can't jump over a fence, you go around it. But the adults seemed determined to smash through the fence just because they had decided that was the only way. They were trapped by their own rules. They had spent 30 years learning exactly how to sit, exactly how to hold their wrists, and exactly which fingers to use for which notes. They were like robots following a strict program. If the program said error, they stopped. The girl, however, was not a robot. She was a child, and children are natural problem solvers. She spent her days climbing trees that were too high and building forts out of things that weren't supposed to be forts. She didn't care about the correct way to do things. She only cared about the result. When her father climbed down from the ladder to take a break, he wiped his forehead and looked at his daughter. "Boring, isn't it?" he whispered with a smile. "They are taking this all very seriously." The girl nodded but kept her eyes on the piano. "They look sad," she whispered back. "They are just frustrated," the father explained. "That music is too hard for anyone to play. It's impossible." The word impossible hung in the air. The girl didn't like that word. She felt a strange buzzing in her chest, a feeling of excitement that she couldn't explain. She looked at the sheet music sitting on the stand. It looked like a scary forest of black lines, but when she looked at the piano keys, they just looked like friends waiting to be pressed. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to try it herself. She wanted to know what would happen if she touched those keys. The afternoon wore on, and the mood in the hall grew heavy. The experts were tired. They had been trying to conquer the piece for 3 days, and their energy was gone. The arguments became quieter, and eventually the head of the festival called for a long break. "Let's clear our heads," he announced wearily. "Let's go get some coffee. We will try again in an hour." This was the moment the atmosphere changed. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by a sudden rush of relaxation. The musicians stood up, stretching their arms and groaning. They gathered their coats and their bags, eager to get out of the room that smelled like old paper and failure. They walked out in groups, chatting about the weather or dinner or anything other than the music that had defeated them. They left their scores on the music stands, too frustrated to pack them away. The girl watched them leave. She saw the stage door close behind the last person. The hall was suddenly very quiet. Her father was busy talking to the sound engineer in the back booth, checking the microphone levels. The stage was empty. The huge, black, shiny piano sat there alone, bathed in a single beam of light from the spotlight her father had. Just adjusted. It looked inviting. The little girl hopped off her chair. Her feet made no sound on the thick carpet. She walked down the center aisle, her heart beating a little faster. She knew she wasn't really allowed to go on stage. Her father had told her to stay in her seat, but the pull of the piano was too strong. It felt like the instrument was calling her name. She climbed up the 3 steps to the platform. The piano looked even bigger up close. It was a monster, but a gentle one. She stood in front of the bench. It was much too high for her. She looked around to make sure no one was watching. The coast was clear. She put her hands on the smooth, cool wood of the bench and hoisted herself up. Her dangled inches above the floor. She pulled herself forward until her tummy was pressed against the front of the keys. She looked at the music. The pages were open to the middle section, the part that had made the famous professor quit just an hour ago. The girl looked at the jumble of notes. She didn't see the math. She didn't see the impossibility. She just saw a picture. To her, the notes looked like a game of hopscotch. She saw where her left hand should start, and she saw where her right hand needed to go. She didn't know that she was supposed to be afraid. She didn't know that the smartest people in the country had failed this exact task. She was just an 8-year-old girl who wanted to make a noise. She took a deep breath, wriggled her fingers to get the blood flowing, and raised her small hands over the keys. She was about to do something that would change everything, but in her mind, she was just playing a game. The silence in the great hall was heavy, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of waiting. The little girl sat on the massive velvet bench, her legs dangling far above the floor. She took a moment to just look at the keys. They were white and black, smooth and cool. To her, they didn't look like the intimidating obstacle course that the experts had described. They just looked like a path waiting to be followed. She reached out with her right hand. Her fingers were small and chubby, nowhere near the long, spider-like fingers of the concert pianists who had tried earlier. She placed her thumb on a white note and her index finger on a black note nearby. She didn't know about the correct posture. She didn't keep her wrists perfectly curved or her elbows tucked in. She just sat up straight and pressed down. The first note rang out, clear and bright. It wasn't a bang and it wasn't a whisper. It was just a sound. Then came the second note and the third. The melody began. It was a simple, haunting tune that seemed to float in the air. The girl hesitated for a split second, listening to the sound fade away. Then she moved her left hand to find the lower notes. Here is where the trouble usually started. The composer had written a group of notes meant to be played together that required a handspan of nearly 10 inches. Every adult who had tried this had to stop because their hands simply couldn't stretch that far without cramping or missing the keys. They saw the notes and thought, I must reach them all at once. But the girl didn't know she was supposed to reach them all at once. She looked at the notes and her brain told her that they all needed to be heard. So she did what was natural to her. She couldn't stretch her hand, so she used a rolling motion. She placed her pinky on the lowest note, then quickly walked her thumb and fingers up the keys to hit the others. It wasn't a simultaneous smash. It was a ripple, like a stone skipping across a lake. Plunk, 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 donk, dot. It sounded fluid. It sounded graceful. It sounded exactly the way the composer might have imagined it in his head, but that no one had ever been able to produce on real keys. She continued. The next challenge was the rhythm. The time signature changed constantly, shifting from a waltz to a march to a strange, skipping beat. The experts had tried to count it out loud, tapping their feet and losing their place in the math, but the girl didn't count. She didn't know what a time signature was. She just felt the beat. She heard the music in her head like a story. Sometimes the story ran fast and sometimes it slowed down. She let her hands follow the story, not the rules. Her feet, which couldn't touch the pedals, swung back and forth happily beneath the bench. She was enjoying herself. A small smile appeared on her face. She was lost in the world of the sound. Unaware that she was doing something historic. Outside in the hallway, the mood was very different. The musicians and professors were standing around with plastic cups of lukewarm coffee. They were venting their frustrations. It's a waste of talent, one older man said, adjusting his tie. I have played at Carnegie Hall. I shouldn't be wasting my time on a practical joke. The structure is flawed, a younger woman added, checking her watch. We proved that. I think we should just cancel the showcase and go home. They were ready to leave. They were ready to dismiss the piece entirely. But then a sound drifted through the heavy oak doors of the rehearsal hall. It was faint at first, just a trickle of notes. The group went quiet. They stopped talking. One of the musicians, a man known for his sensitive hearing, frowned and tilted his head. Wait, he said. Is someone in there? Maybe the radio is on, suggested another. No, the first man said. That's the piece. That's the impossible piece. The musicians looked at each other, confused. They had left the stage empty. The score was sitting on the stand. Who was playing? And more importantly, how were they playing it? The sound coming from the hall wasn't a struggle. It wasn't the messy banging they had been doing for 3 days. It was flowing. It was fast and light and incredibly intricate. Curiosity overpowered their fatigue. They set down their coffee cups. As a group, they moved silently toward the doors. The head of the festival, an older woman with silver hair, reached out and pushed one of the heavy doors open just a crack. The sound washed over them, clearer now. They peered into the dimly lit hall. The stage was bathed in the spotlight. And there, sitting on the massive bench, looking like a tiny doll in front of a giant monster, was the little girl. The musicians froze in the doorway. They couldn't believe their eyes. It was the technician's daughter, the child who had been sitting quietly in the back row. She was playing notes that they had deemed physically impossible. She was navigating the jumps that had made them pull muscles in their hands. Inside, the girl was approaching the hardest section of the song. This was the part where the hands had to cross over each other in a blur of motion, playing a rhythm that felt like falling down stairs. The experts had tried to play this with brute force, slamming the keys to make sure they were heard. The girl, however, treated it gently. She let her hands dance. Her left hand reached over her right hand to play a high note, and then immediately snapped back to the bass. It was a risky move, dangerous for someone with small hands. But she did it without fear. She didn't fear making a mistake, so she didn't tense up. Because she was relaxed, her hands moved faster than the adults ever could. She was like water flowing around a rock. The rock was the difficulty of the music, and she just glided right past it. The sound was beautiful. It was emotional. The angry, chaotic notes that the experts had produced were gone. In their place was a melody that wept and laughed at the same time. The girl swayed slightly from side to side, completely in the zone. She wasn't thinking about the music. She was just being the music. The adults in the doorway were stunned. Their mouths hung open slightly. They looked at the sheet music in the girl's lap, then at her hands, trying to figure out the trick. How was she doing that chord? She was breaking it up, rolling it, but somehow making it sound like one fluid sound. How was she hitting that rhythm? She wasn't counting. She was swaying. The head of the festival felt a chill run down her spine. She realized then what the problem had been. It wasn't the music, it was them. It was their years of training, their rigid rules, their belief that there was only one right way to play the piano. This child didn't know the rules, so she couldn't break them. She only knew what sounded right to her ears. The girl didn't notice her audience. She was too busy. She hit a run of notes that went zooming up the keyboard, her fingers moving like a blur of spiders. She ended the phrase with a loud, joyful chord, lifting both hands off the keys in a little flourish. She let the sound ring out in the vast, empty hall. She sat there for a moment, grinning at the piano, proud of the noise she had made. She thought it was the most fun game she had ever played. Then she heard a floorboard creak in the doorway. She turned around, her heart skipping a beat. She saw the row of stern faces looking back at her in total shock. The magic bubble popped. She was just a kid again, sitting where she wasn't supposed to be. She quickly pulled her hands back into her lap, looking frightened. She knew she was going to be in trouble. She didn't know she had just made history. She just thought she was about to get yelled at for touching the expensive piano. The little girl sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands tucked safely in her lap. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it thumping against her ribs. She looked at the group of adults standing in the doorway. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and their mouths slightly open. They weren't smiling. To an 8-year-old who knew she wasn't supposed to be touching the expensive instrument, this looked like trouble. She was ready for a scolding. She was ready to be told to go back to her seat and never touch the keys again. She started to slide off the bench, intending to run to her father, but the head of the festival stepped forward. She was a woman who usually commanded respect with a stern voice and a sharp gaze. But now her voice was soft, almost trembling. "Wait," she whispered. She held up a hand, not to stop the girl from leaving, but as if to beg her to stay. "Don't go, please." The girl stopped, one foot dangling in the air. She looked back at them, confused. The other musicians slowly walked into the room, moving as if they were in a trance. They surrounded the piano, but not in a threatening way. They looked at the girl with a mixture of disbelief and awe. They didn't see a naughty child. They saw a magician, one of the younger professors. A man who had failed to play the piece just an hour earlier knelt down so he was eye level with her. "How did you do that?" he asked gently. "That part in the middle? The big jump?" The girl blinked, her shyness fading just a little bit as she thought about the question. She shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just jumped." "But the rhythm," another musician chimed in, stepping closer. "The time signature changes. It's impossible to count that fast." The girl looked at him with a puzzled expression. "I didn't count," she said simply. "I just listened to the music in my head." It sounded like a chase, like a cat running after a mouse. So I played it like that. The room fell silent again. The musicians looked at each other. It suddenly became so clear to them. For days, they had been treating the music like a math problem. They had been counting, analyzing, and forcing their hands to obey the rules. They had been so focused on playing the notes correctly that they forgot to play the music. This child didn't care about the rules. She only cared about the story the music was telling. She played a cat chasing a mouse, and because she felt that emotion, her hands knew exactly what to do. The head of the festival pointed to the sheet music. And that chord? The one that requires a 10-inch stretch? No one can reach that. The girl looked at her hands. She held them up, palms facing out. They were tiny compared to the professor's hands. I know, she said. My hands are too small. I tried to stretch them like you did, but it hurt. She paused, looking at the piano keys. So I just rolled them. Like this. She reached out and quickly played the chord again, her hand moving in a fluid wave from the lowest note to the highest. It sounded like a gentle ripple of water, not a jagged crash. The professor gasped. We were told to strike it simultaneously, he muttered to himself. The manuscript says. But the sound, the girl said innocently. It sounds prettier if it rolls. The adults were stunned. They had spent decades following instructions written on a page, believing that those instructions were absolute laws. But here was a child, using her natural instinct to make the music sound better. She had broken the law of the composer, but in doing so, she had fulfilled the true spirit of the piece. The composer hadn't made a mistake in writing it. The mistake was in the adults assuming there was only one way to play it. Just then, the heavy-side door swung open. The girl's father rushed in, looking worried. He had finished his work in the sound booth and realized his daughter was missing from her chair. I'm so sorry, he called out, rushing toward the stage. I hope she wasn't bothering you. I told her to stay in her seat. He reached out to grab her hand, ready to scold her and pull her away. But the head of the festival stepped between them, blocking his path gently. No, she said, smiling a genuine, warm smile for the first time in days. She wasn't bothering us. In fact, she just did something that no one in this room has been able to do for 50 years. The father stopped, confused. He looked at his daughter, who was standing by the piano with her hands behind her back, looking at her shoes. What do you mean? He asked. She played the impossible piece, the professor explained, still looking at the girl with wonder. And she played it beautifully. The father's jaw dropped. He looked at the piano, then at the legendary musicians who were nodding in agreement. He looked back at his little girl, the one who took piano lessons on a cheap keyboard at home and who loved to bang out nursery rhymes. He felt a swell of pride in his chest that was so big it almost choked him up. The atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. The frustration, the arrogance, and the negativity were gone. In their place was a sense of humility and wonder. The masters of the classical world realized that they had been defeated by their own experience. They knew too much, and their knowledge had become a wall. The girl knew nothing, and her innocence was the door that walked right through that wall. The girl, unaware of the profound lesson she had just taught, just tugged on her father's shirt. Can we go get ice cream now? She whispered. I'm hungry. The head of the festival laughed. It was a sound of pure relief. Yes, she said. Go get ice cream? You deserve it. As the father led his daughter out of the hall, the musicians watched them go. They didn't clap or cheer because it didn't feel like a performance anymore. It felt like a miracle. The girl walked out with her ice cream, not caring about the history she had made. She didn't care that she had solved a puzzle that had stumped the world's best musicians. To her, it was just a fun way to spend an afternoon. The experts turned back to the piano. The impossible piece was still sitting on the stand, but it didn't look like a monster anymore. It looked like music. One by one, the musicians sat down again. But this time, they didn't try to force it. They didn't try to show off their strength. They remembered the girl's small hands rolling over the keys. They remembered her playing the chase. They took a deep breath, closed their eyes for a moment to hear the story, and then they began to play. The music changed. It became fluid, emotional, and human. The piece was no longer impossible. It just needed to be played with the heart of a child. The legend of the impossible piece was retired that day, replaced by a new, quieter legend about a little girl who reminded the world that sometimes the best way to solve a hard problem is to stop thinking like an expert and start playing like a child.